Hey everyone. Tonight we're diving into the weird and gloomy year of 536, a year so cursed. Even medieval peasants who were no strangers to misery looked around and said, yeah, something's definitely off. So before you get too cozy, take a moment to like the video and subscribe only if you genuinely enjoy this nonsense I'm putting out. And drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is. It's always fun to see who's tagging along from all corners of the globe. Now, dim those lights. Maybe turn on a fan for some soothing white noise. Let's embark on tonight's little journey together. Let's start the story. It's the early 6th century. You're a merchant, a monk, or maybe just a guy hoping your turnip crop won't completely tank this year. Life isn't exactly glamorous, but at least it's predictable. Seasons come and go. The sun rises, does its job, and you still complain about it like clockwork. Then 536 hits, and suddenly the sun disappears. At first, it's subtle. A few gloomy mornings, the sky looking kinda weird. People squint. Farmers mutter. Some joke the gods just overslept. But those clouds won't budge. The light stays dim. Day after day. Week after week. The sun keeps half-assing it like it's doing the bare minimum to avoid getting fired. Across Europe and Asia, everyone knows something's wrong, and no. It's not just your toga getting soggy from the rain. Byzantine historian Procopius, not exactly known for his stand-up comedy, wrote the sun gave off light but didn't shine. Historians think this was seriously bad news, and basically that we're all doomed. Other chroniclers describe a dry fog blanketing the world. Not smoke, not mist, just a weird, stubborn gray haze that refused to quit. The wind didn't blow it away. No rain to wash it out. It just hovered, like the planet itself was trying to send a vague atmospheric warning, and nobody got the memo. The result? A crappy year. Crops that refused to ripen. Plants stopped growing. Birds just circled around confused. And humans, being humans, tried to explain it. Some said it was divine punishment. Others blamed magic, eclipses, or their neighbors' sins. Maybe some guy blamed a goat. History never bothered to note his name, but you know he was there. Meanwhile, regular folks, villagers, farmers, overworked scribes just had to live with it. No sun meant colder weather, less food, more chaos, and zero clue how long the cosmic prank would last. 536 didn't start with a bang. It kicked off quietly, with strange skies, creeping dread, and that unmistakable feeling something had snapped. Spoiler alert, this was just the beginning. So technically, the sun rose, but it was barely showing up to work. It's now 5:36 and worldwide. Folks are staring up like the sky owes them an explanation. The once reliable, bright, slightly judgmental sun is now a pale, weak disk that looks like it's about to call in sick. You'd get more warmth and enthusiasm from a dying candle. Eyewitnesses from Constantinople to China, Mesopotamia to Ireland all reported the same worrying thing. Daylight was nearly indistinguishable from twilight. You wake thinking it's morning. By noon, you're convinced you're going blind. And dusk. Good luck figuring out when that actually happened. The sun stopped setting. It just quietly vanished mid-conversation. Contemporary writers describe the sun as blue and shadowless. If you're wondering what kind of sun has no shadow, congrats, you're asking the same question. Terrified people in the 6th century asked right before they freaked out and prayed in their stew pots. In China, People said stars were visible during the day. Think about that. You're tending your rice fields, looking up at constellations. This isn't just weird weather. The sky is gently resetting itself. And it's not just dim. It's cold. Because the sunlight was filtered through some mysterious and inconvenient haze. Temperatures dropped. Sunset. Good luck figuring out exactly when that was. The sun didn't so much set as quietly vanish mid-conversation. Contemporary writers described the sun as blue and shadowless. Now, if you're wondering what kind of sun doesn't cast a shadow, congratulations, you're asking the same terrifying question every poor soul did in the 6th century, right before panicking in their basement prayers. In China, people claimed they could see stars during the day. Think about that. You're tending your rice field. Look up, and there are constellations. That's not just weather. It's the sky slowly resetting itself. And it's not just dim, cold, too, because sunlight is filtered by some mysterious, inconvenient something. Temperatures drop. Not the cozy hot chocolate kind of drop. More like spring pretending it's January and your toes have given up. The crazy part, people in 536 had zero clue about atmospheric science. They didn't know volcanoes were erupting thousands of miles away. All they knew was the sun had stopped working. And when your crops, warmth, and will to live depend on that sun, things get pretty grim, of course. Everyone scrambled for answers. Religious folks called it divine punishment. Astrologers blamed creepy planet alignments. Local leaders probably pointed fingers at foreigners. Bad omens. Or that one weird guy in the village who always seemed off, whatever the excuse. One thing was clear. The sun stopped shining. And when the sky's main star takes a break, you know things are about to get way worse. Sometime in 536, people started realizing it wasn't just the sun acting up. The whole atmosphere decided to throw a tantrum. Reports from every continent kept coming in about a bizarre phenomenon. A dry fog hung around, unlike any normal weather. It wasn't fog eventually clears. It wasn't smoke. Smoke smells like something's burning. This fog was more like a damp ghost shadow stalking everyone, killing visibility and spirits alike. Procopius, the ever-serious Byzantine historian, described the sun as shining without brightness and said this spooky fog cloaked the world for a whole year, 12 months of no clear sky. No clue what time it was. No idea what season it was. Wondering if life would ever be the same again in the East. Chinese sources reported golden dust falling from the sky and even some surreal summer snow. Imagine waking up in July to find your crops frozen and your chickens utterly confused. The Irish chronicles mention a bread shortage, which is poetic code for mass famine and a deep cultural trauma. You know things are bad when even your bread abandons you first. So where did this fog come from? Nowadays, we think it was the aftermath of a volcanic eruption, or maybe several. Think of someone blowing out birthday candles way too hard and ruining the whole party. Ash and sulfur aerosol got blasted into the stratosphere, hanging around for months, reflecting sunlight, blocking warmth, and turning your winter coat into year-round fashion. Of course, folks in the 6th century had no clue about any of this. All they knew was the world turned dark, cold, and vaguely cursed. Crops wouldn't grow. Rivers slowed to a crawl. Entire regions stopped getting rain. Livestock probably started dropping dead or just wandered into the fog. terrified of existential dread. And just when people were getting used to this new Twilight Zone reality, nature decided to spice things up with a bonus pandemic. Because what's better than a never-clearing fog? A plague tagging right behind it centuries later. After the panic and starvation finally calmed down, science showed up fashionably late, but still useful. Historians and climate scientists using ice cores and radiocarbon dating asked, what turned the sky Gothic in 536? The answer, volcanoes. Specifically, a massive eruption, maybe 2 or even 3. Because when Earth gets mad, it really goes off. The prime suspect is a huge eruption in Iceland. Picture Earth saying, I'm tired, then coughing up billions of tons of ash into the stratosphere. This ash stuck around like an X-marked stain, blocking sunlight and tanking global temperatures. Greenland ice cores show a sulfur spike that year. Basically, it's a frozen receipt proving the planet survived a major blowout. Antarctic ice tells a similar story, which is impressive considering it's 10,000 meters away. But here's where it gets juicy. The first eruption might not have been a solo act. Evidence points to a second eruption in 540 and possibly a third in 547. Yes, this disaster wasn't a one-hit wonder. It was a trilogy. Volcanoes of Doom, Parts 1, 2, and 3, plus a side order of famine and plague. Ash and sulfur aerosols from these eruptions spread worldwide, reflecting sunlight and dropping global temps. Think of it like Earth slathering on a thick SPF 5000 sunscreen without the smell. In places like Mesopotamia, this meant crop failures and economic collapse, the trilogy of volcanic doom, complete with famine and plague, turned the 6th century into a very dark time indeed. Ash and sulfur aerosols from these eruptions blanketed the globe, reflecting sunlight and chilling the planet. Picture Earth putting on a thick layer of SPF 5000 sunscreen, but without the smell. In places like Mesopotamia, this meant crops failed and economies crashed. China, snow in summer. In Europe, grain prices shot up. And not like a buzzing stock market kind of way. More like your neighbor selling his goat for a bag of moldy oats. And just to be clear, nobody in 536 had a clue what a volcano was. They didn't connect the dim sun to some distant mountain throwing a tantrum thousands of miles away. They just looked up, saw the darkness creeping in, and figured God was in a bad mood. Honestly, not the worst guess they had. While modern science gets the mechanics now, back then all they had were terrified priests, freaked out farmers, and a sky that looked like the world forgot to wake up. The sun was on strike. The sky looked like it needed therapy, and nobody knew what season it was anymore. Welcome to 536 Now, featuring hypothermia as a bonus. Thanks to volcanic ash clouds, Earth entered what scientists today call a volcanic winter. Sounds cool until you realize it's not a metaphor. Global temperatures dropped by about 2.55 degrees, which in medieval speak means your entire food supply just died. Now, if that doesn't sound like a big deal to your modern overheated brain, try farming in a world where summers were colder than your ex's replies. Wheat, barley, grapes all just lying there like, nah, not today. And this wasn't some short cold snap. Tree ring data from Ireland, Scandinavia, North America, Asia, all show stunted growth. Trees weren't thriving. They were barely hanging on. And if trees are struggling, you can imagine how bad it is for the folks trying to eat what grows on them. Frost came early. Snow lasted longer. Spring became just a rumor. Farmers had to pretend they knew what they were doing, while watching whole fields fail like badly planned medieval group projects. In China, records talk about golden dust falling like snow. In Korea, people wrote about summer frost. In Europe, summer either didn't show up or came drunk and left early. Meanwhile, animals weren't cooperating either. Herds thinned out. Some died. Some migrated. Others just refused to reproduce, which is fair enough. What followed was a perfect storm of crop failures, starving communities, and growing suspicion that the world was ending, really slowly and in terrible lighting. It wasn't just the cold. It was confusion, uncertainty, unpredictability of the seasons. Everyone had calendars, festivals, planting schedules. None of it made any sense anymore. You could plant in April, only to watch frost kill everything in May. By June, you were eating pine bark stew and pretending it was soup. Yeah, the world got colder. But the real chill was the creeping fear that warmth might never come back. As the sun set and temperatures dropped, it was clear something else was dying too. Hope and wheat, but mostly wheat. In a pre-industrial world where almost everyone farmed, ate what farmers grew or stole from others, a bad harvest wasn't just sad, it was an existential crisis. And in 536, it wasn't just one failed harvest, one disaster after another, until people forgot what a full stomach felt like. Crops didn't stand a chance, with medieval sunlight at a minimum and cold air sneaking in like an unwelcome relative. Fields across Europe and Asia simply stopped cooperating. Barley barely sprouted. Wheat gave up halfway. Forget about grapes. Your wine turned into sadness, sealed with a cork. In Ireland, chronicles mention bread shortages, a poetic way of saying famine. No bread meant no food. No food meant no energy. No energy meant no farmers plowing fields. Suddenly, the whole system collapsed like a hay wagon overloaded with bad grass. China wasn't doing any better. During the Northern Way, frost came early and crops withered. The system collapsed like a hay wagon overloaded with bad grass. China wasn't doing any better. During the Northern Way era, frost hit early. Crops withered. Rice fields froze solid. Fields turned into useless mud. And instead of thriving villages, you had survivors wandering around ignoring any roots they hadn't eaten last week. Grain prices skyrocketed wherever anything was left. In Constantinople, people sold their last possessions for moldy bread. In England, there's evidence the population was shrinking. In India, monsoon cycles got messed up. In Ethiopia, royal inscriptions suddenly stopped, and trust me, that's never a good sign. The truly brutal part, this wasn't a blink and you miss it disaster. It dragged on. When the year 537 rolled around, Earth still wasn't cooperating. It kept playing the tiny glimmer of hope game. A warm day here, a sprout there, just to get frostbitten the next morning. The result, a farming community stuck in a vicious loop of false starts and bitter endings. Over and over. Medieval farmers had a neat phrase for this divine punishment. Modern scientists call it volcanic climate disruption. But back then, farmers just called it the longest, hungriest winter ever. And if you think this global mess was some unlucky local hiccup, think again. Year 536 didn't discriminate. This was an equal opportunity disaster. Let's start in China, where everything was fine until, bam, snow in the middle of summer. Yes, you heard that right. 100% real. Chinese Northern Way Court records note weird weather frost in summer. Harvests so bad, people wondered if the sky just got bored of Earth. But it wasn't just snow. There were dust storms, droughts, and yellow fog. Basically, Nature blew its entire special effects budget on North Asia. The emperor even sent gifts to heaven begging for help. Heaven didn't even respond. Seemed like the big guy just ghosted him. Result famine, rebellions, and the dynasty collapsed soon after. Because if there's one thing that kills faith in your leader, it's freezing and starving under their rule. Meanwhile, in Ireland, monks were jotting down gloomy notes in their chronicles. Notes like "no bread" from year 12 to 15, which, coming from medieval monks, basically sounds like screaming into a pillow. Bad bread sounds poetic, but it really meant no wheat, no oats, and no porridge for the Irish back then. A bad harvest meant eating moss and anything that didn't run fast enough. Famine ravaged communities. Livestock died or got eaten early. Trade slowed. Villages shrank. And remember, this was an era with no food banks, no emergency grain stores, and definitely no online recipes for a meal made from turnips and regret. The weather seemed to mock them too. Short, gloomy, cold days. The sun popped out like it had better things to do, and people turned to religion, superstition, or blaming their neighbors, anything to feel less trapped that week. This wasn't local weather drama. This was a global disaster, stretching out like an endless gloomy day, from China's mountains to Ireland's bogs. Everyone had the same terrifying thought: what if the world never bounces back? While China froze and Ireland starved, Scandinavia disappeared, not in a dramatic dragon-riding flame kind of way. No, this was way scarier. Scandinavia didn't leave with a bang. It just slowly turned off the lights and left the party without saying goodbye. The clues come from trees, specifically tree rings. Trees are nature's historians, minus the nagging, but they live way longer. Around 536 trees in Scandinavia stopped growing normally. Thin, tight rings. No expansion. Zero life. You can almost hear them muttering. Hang in there. We got this. This was a sign temperatures dropped sharply, and growing seasons got so short even pine trees threw in the towel. And these trees were born for gloomy northern weather. Archaeologists also noticed a scary drop in human activity. Settlements went quiet. Farms got abandoned. Burial sites show population declines. Like the whole community said, "All right, we're done here." Then vanished into the woods, maybe to starve, run away, or just because even Vikings need to escape existential nightmares. This happened before the official Viking Age kicked off. And that's a big deal. By the time the North started raiding monasteries and causing chaos from Ireland to Byzantium, they'd already survived one of the worst environmental disasters in history. Some scholars even think the trauma of this era famine, isolation, population collapse helped shape Norse culture, the grim fate worldview, tales of cold, ruthless gods, and endless winters. Yep, probably that. The weather in 536 deserves less myth and more reality. And since the landscape was already a harsh mess, this climate disaster didn't just hurt, it wrecked everything. Livestock froze to death. Food stores were empty. Entire families vanished in a single season. But, unlike some other parts of the world, the Scandinavians didn't leave behind dramatic chronicles or sad complaints. They left silence and empty spaces where people once lived. And in some ways, that's even worse. Reading about someone's sorrow in a history book is one thing. Digging up a village and realizing no one ever came back, that's a whole different nightmare. Now, As the sun starts dimming on the planet, let's dive into the Byzantine Empire, specifically the dazzling capital, Constantinople. Enter Emperor Justinian the Great, a guy with big ambitions, a brutal legal code, and zero clue that he was about to host one of the nastiest decades in human history. Before 536, Justinian was living the dream. He compiled Roman law into the legendary Corpus Juris Civilis. He bankrolled massive construction projects like Hagia Sophia. He was reconquering ancient Roman lands like a nostalgic tourist. Everything was suspiciously smooth sailing. Then the sky turned gray. Temperatures dropped. Food ran out. And the empire that never slept got hit by some of its worst waves yet. Constantinople relied heavily on imported grain, so when Egypt's crops failed, the city was not thrilled. Bread prices soared. Hunger spread through the capital. And as if things weren't bleak enough, the darkened sky had everyone wondering if the apocalypse was actually knocking. It got worse. Justinian, always proud of God's favor, now had to explain why God seemed to have switched teams, a terrible PR move for the empire. Religious panic exploded. Clergy warned of Judgment Day. Some people turned to hardcore asceticism. Others just blamed everyone. And Justinian? He doubled down, funding more churches, praying harder, and maybe muttering. This isn't in the emperor's manual, but the hits kept coming, because no climate disaster is complete without a pandemic riding shotgun. In 541, Justinian's empire got slammed hard by the first recorded outbreak of the plague, the infamous Justinian Plague. It showed up by ship, just like most bad news, and in just a few short years, wiped out 25 to 50 million people, nearly half the empire's population. Justinian himself caught it, somehow. He survived. But his body was never the same, and neither was the empire. Rebellions erupted. Military campaigns stalled. Officials died faster than replacements, and all Justinian wanted was to restore Rome's glory. Instead, he became the emperor, shadowed by darkness, hunger, disease, and despair, exactly in that order. As if 536 wasn't enough to snag the gold medal in historical misery, nature tossed in a new player for the misery squad: disease, specifically plague, making its terrifying debut as the Justinian Plague. This wasn't your average medieval sniffles or a bad mushroom trip. This was the real deal pandemic, straight out of a nightmare survival guide. And it hit at the absolute worst possible time, which, honestly, was the whole theme of the decade. By 541, when the sun still hadn't fully bounced back and people were freezing, starving, or both, the plague had spread into Constantinople through grain shipments because, of course, nothing spices up your end-of-the-world party like a cargo hold full of rats, caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis. This disease spread fast thanks to fleas, rats, and packed cities where germ theory was still a sci-fi dream. Symptoms included fever, vomiting, swollen lymph glands, and sudden death, the kind of thing that makes you miss famine. Estimates vary, but the death toll was staggering: 25 to 50 million across the Byzantine Empire and beyond. That's nearly half the population wiped out in just a few short years. You couldn't swing a sword without hitting someone dead. Emperor Justinian caught it and survived, but many of his officials weren't so lucky, because, of course, nothing says apocalypse party like a cargo hold full of rats caused by Yersinia pestis. This plague spread fast thanks to fleas, rats, crowded cities, and the fact that germ theory hadn't been invented yet. Symptoms included fever, vomiting, swollen lymph nodes, and sudden death. The kind of thing that makes you almost miss famine. Estimates vary, but the death toll was staggering: 25 to 50 million across the Byzantine Empire and beyond. That's nearly half the population gone in just a few short years. You couldn't swing a sword without hitting someone 6 feet under. Emperor Justinian himself got sick and survived. But many officials weren't so lucky. You couldn't swing without hitting the fallen. Emperor Justinian caught it and lived, but many of his officials weren't as fortunate. Bureaucracy froze up. Military campaigns failed, and cities emptied faster than the bishop's wine barrel at a party for the average farmer. This wasn't a scientific event. This was God's loudspeaker screaming at them. And with the sky still gray and crops still dying, people saw the plague as the final act, the divine mic drop. Mass graves were dug. Priests ran out of prayers. Funeral rites got boiled down to "he's dead." Next, made it worse, pure randomness. Some folks died in a day. Others survived to watch everyone else vanish. It wasn't just tragic. It was downright unfair, even by medieval standards. And just like that, the grim legacy of 536 went viral. By now, the world in 536 and the years after weren't just suffering. It was skyrocketing. The sun was clocking out early. Crops filed for bankruptcy, and the plague turned Europe into the hottest party nobody wanted to attend. But for the regular folks, the peasants, monks, and nobody shepherds, the horror wasn't academic. It was everyday survival on hard mode. You wake up and it's still dark, not some artsy fog drifting over moody hills, but like the sun just gave up and stayed in bed. You shuffle out into the cold air, stare at your wilted barley field, and remember, dinner last night was half a turnip and a vague memory of bread. Livestock didn't fare better. Chickens stopped laying. Cows were skin and bones. Pigs became so rare and valuable. You'd think they were unicorns. A neighbor vanished last week, and there's this awkward silence whenever someone mentions stew. Food shortages. Not just local. They were continental. Markets crashed. Wheat became currency. And if you had a carrot and no kids, congratulations. You basically were a feudal lord in Constantinople. Prices soared so high, even the nobles started feeling the hunger pangs out in the boonies. It was worse. The famine wasn't a sudden blow. It crept in slow, ugly, and didn't care about fairness. Then came the psychological hit. No sunlight to mark the days properly, so time got all vague. Was it morning, night, or Wednesday? Nobody really knew. They just kept working, praying, and hoping the sky would finally say sorry. Spoiler, it didn't. Clergy preached repentance. Nobles hoarded food. The common folk stared at the gray sky, wondering if this was just life now. A long, cold, bleak stretch with the occasional rat cameo. Hope became a luxury. Most people just tried not to be the next funeral. Honestly, if you survived famine, plague, freezing weather, and the general existential dread, congrats. You qualified as a survivor in 536, which meant malnourished, battered, and squinting toward the horizon, hoping the sun might make a comeback. After years of hunger, plague, and endless dusk, society did what society does best under pressure, slowly fell apart while insisting everything was fine. It wasn't just hunger anymore. The social fabric, more burlap sack than silk, started fraying. The hierarchy cracked, the labor system collapsed, and people began acting less like a community and more like grim players in a survival game nobody wanted to play. Local authorities, if they weren't fleeing or dying of plague, struggled hard to keep order. Coins lost value, trade routes dried up, and honestly, if you stole a loaf of bread, you'd get either a sermon or a sword, depending on when the local judge last ate. The nobles weren't looking so hot either. Many hoarded food. Some tried raising taxes, yes, in a famine. That's either bravery or suicide, depending on how many peasants were left. Others just fled their estates and abandoned the coast to figure it out on their own. But they didn't. Meanwhile, religious institutions. Society started doing what society does best under pressure, slowly falling apart while insisting everything's fine. It wasn't just hunger anymore. The social fabric, more burlap sack than silk, started fraying. Hierarchies broke down, labor systems collapsed, and people began acting less like a community and more like desperate players in a bleak survival game. Local authorities, if they weren't fleeing or dying from plague, struggled to keep order. Coins lost value, trade routes dried up, and honestly, if you stole a loaf of bread, you'd get either a lecture or a sword, depending on when the local judge last ate. The nobility wasn't spared either. Many hoarded food. Some tried to raise taxes, yeah, in a famine, bold move, or suicide, depending on the farmer-to-ruler ratio. Labor. Others just ran away from the estate and abandoned the coast to figure things out on their own. Spoiler alert, they didn't. Meanwhile, religious groups became both shelters and scapegoats. Some priests told the starving crowds to repent harder. Others tried to help by handing out the meager supplies they had. And then there were the folks who decided it was the perfect time to announce the apocalypse and start a new cult deep in the woods. Moral lines blurred. Theft went mainstream. Violence spiked. If someone in your village had food, they suddenly became both super popular and super paranoid. And remember, no central news, no plague tracking apps, no reliable updates from far-off cities, just rumors of divine punishment. Demons, sunlight returning to distant lands, or entire regions wiped off the map. People fled cities. Villages vanished. Whole areas were ghost towns. People ran from cities. Villages disappeared. Whole regions became deserted. And when no one's maintaining roads, fields, or temples, even the landscape starts to fall apart. Civilization didn't crash in flames and glory. It just quietly faded away, like someone wiping a painting with a damp cloth. Historians back then stopped writing about politics. They were writing about how the sky still hadn't turned blue. Long story short, the world wasn't ending. It just lost track of itself. After years of death, darkness, and what felt like a divine prank, the world started to bounce back. No big boom, no epic movie sunlight breaking through clouds. Nope, more like a tired sigh and a few shy sunbeams. That feeling wasn't a cruel joke. By the early 540s, the mysterious ash began to clear. The sun, like it just came back from some weirdly unexplained vacation, started shining again, cautiously, as if unsure if it was welcome. Crops started growing slowly. Not great. But hey, they grew. Farmers began planting with hope instead of despair. And when green shoots poked out of the ground, folks didn't cry in horror, they were just a bit skeptical. In Constantinople, Grain prices finally stabilized. Bread, once a sacred relic, was now edible again. The empire shuffled forward slowly, patching holes in the economy and pretending everything was part of the plan. In rural villages, new generations were born, generations that didn't. Remember the sunless years? Survivors aged with faces that had seen too much weather and not enough soup. Culturally, the trauma left its mark. Some scholars think the gloomy tone of later medieval apocalypse literature started here. Because once you've survived famine, plague, societal collapse, and endless fog, writing cheerful spring poems gets a bit tricky. Populations across Europe and Asia were still way down. Whole settlements vanished. And rebuilding wasn't just about houses. It was relearning how to live like humans instead of hungry, cold ghosts. Even when life normalized, people lived with existential caution, like the planet might just switch off the sun again, just to see what happens. The Byzantine Empire staggered back up. Chinese dynasties reformed and adapted. Scandinavia reemerged. And eventually, those Vikings set sail again, causing headaches for everyone else. But behind all that was a shared relief that the worst might finally be over. For most of history, the year 536 was just a weird footnote about truly terrible stuff. Ancient writers knew it was awful. Medieval chroniclers often complained about darkness and famine, but no one knew why the sun hid itself unless you wanted to blame God gone mad or demons eating the sky. It wasn't until the 20th century, when humans got good at drilling into ice instead of just falling through it, that this mystery started to unravel. Enter ice cores, long cylinders of ancient ice pulled from Greenland and Antarctica, like Earth's super passive-aggressive memory sticks. Inside those layers, sulfur and ash spikes appeared around 536 AD, plus two more spikes in 540 and 547, leading scientists to a conclusion medieval folks never dreamed of: volcanoes. Huge volcanoes, maybe more than one. At first, researchers thought it was a massive eruption in Iceland. Then they looked at volcanoes in Central America, then Indonesia, or maybe Alaska. Basically, the planet burped. And scientists still argue about which lung it came from. But the result was the same. Volcanic ash shot up into the stratosphere and spread worldwide, reflecting sunlight and dropping temperatures for years. Nature's version of turning off the lights and forgetting where the switch is. This insight changed how we understand climate disasters. That wasn't divine punishment. It was geophysics delivering a cosmic punch. The cool part: modern science didn't just solve one mystery. The 6th century collapse wasn't just a bunch of random disasters anymore. They're all connected. A massive natural event, or maybe 3 in a row, triggered waves of misery across continents. And the scary part, it could happen again. Volcanoes don't care about your Wi-Fi or your global supply chain. They'll do their 536 thing, again block out the sun, and watch us freak out. At least now, we know why our tomatoes died. But knowing the cause doesn't change what people went through. For them, the sky went pitch black, food ran out, and no one had answers. Science took just 1/500th of a year to say, oh yeah, definitely volcanoes. History's had some rough years. Tons of them. In 1347 there was the Black Death. 1914 kicked off World War I. And 2020, well, let's just not open that mask box again. But 536 AD keeps a special place in the top 10 worst human experiences. Not just bad, but truly awful. A multi-year nightmare of disasters plus extinction-level events. What makes 536 haunting isn't just volcano winters, famine, plagues, or population collapse. It's that they all happened at once. In a fragile pre-modern world, stuck between mud and superstition, imagine surviving a year almost completely in darkness, starving, and hearing endless sermons on existence, a fresh volcanic eruption, and a helpful reminder that, nope, you still haven't seen the sun. Now picture the less famous, equally rude cousin of the Black Death knocking on your city's door in year 5, saying, "Hey, I'm moving in." Nobody back then had words for climate chaos. No clue about volcanoes erupting thousands of miles away. And definitely no epidemiology podcasts. All they saw was a world suddenly losing all meaning. And then sounds, maybe that's the real takeaway. Because even now, with satellites, scientists, and 24/7 news cycles, there's still something terrifying about a year when the sky suddenly went pitch black and no one knew why. It reminds us nature doesn't owe us explanations. At any moment, this planet can throw a tantrum so big it sends us back to firewood and wild guesses. But humans endure. They suffer, starve, bury their loved ones, and keep living. Not because they have answers, but because they have no other choice. Yeah, 536 was the worst year to be alive. And it stretched out like a cosmic hangover for decades. But it's also a story of survival. That's what makes it fascinating. Because deep down, we all suspect that if the sun dipped tomorrow, we'd still argue about bread prices, blame the government, and try to stew whatever's left in the cupboard, just like they did. The 12th century didn't start with a bang, but a whisper. The sound of the 12th century wasn't a big boom, but a whisper. The creak of stones dragged by oxen and hymns echoing from dusty fields by crumbling Romanesque churches. Something huge was happening across France, England, the Holy Roman Empire, and even the far-off Spanish borderlands. Churches started reaching for heaven, but why Europe was changing fast? Cities grew. Trade bounced back, and churches more like show-off cathedrals needed to remind everyone who's boss. What better way than building the biggest, scariest buildings anyone had ever seen? This wasn't a minor upgrade. It was an architectural arms race. Towns competed not with swords, but with stone. If one city built a church with a 50-foot nave, the next city wanted one twice as long, with more stained glass, more towers, and more miracles carved into limestone. Bishops wanted their legacy etched in stone. Kings wanted citizens to see divine power in architecture, and the regular folks, they just hoped to get into heaven. A coin, a pilgrimage, hard work. But none of this would have worked without someone figuring out how to cheat gravity. Enter Gothic style. This new approach changed everything people thought they knew about. Church design. No more thick, short walls. No more tiny windows, just big enough to let in a hint of daylight, reminding you that yes, the sun still exists. Gothic architecture mixed with air and light. It wants God to peek inside and you to look out. Pointy arches, ribbed vaults, and those magical flying buttresses, all aiming upward, soaking in more light, and making humans feel utterly tiny in the face of the divine. What started as humble experiments at Sens Cathedral exploded into a full-blown craze. For the next 4 centuries, Europe went wild with stone carving, scaffold climbing, and stained glass assembly. And the craziest part, most of these cathedrals took centuries to build. Generations were born and died before the last spire was done. This wasn't just construction. It was faith materialized, one stone at a time. Behind every cathedral wasn't just divine inspiration. It was a dusty army of geniuses. Leading the charge wasn't a priest or nobleman, but a celebrated stone expert armed with a compass, a chisel, and a death wish. These medieval rock stars didn't wear leather jackets. They wore limestone-dusted linen. Master masons weren't just contractors. They were architects, engineers, artists, and sometimes cult leaders. Because when you ask peasants to haul multi-ton stones 50 feet up with ropes and wooden pulleys, you need charisma, or at least a really convincing blueprint. But here's the kicker. Most of these guys weren't nobles. They climbed the guild ladder, starting as lowly apprentices sweeping floors and fetching tools. Then they became skilled journeymen, hopping from site to site, church to church, collecting secrets like Pokemon cards. Only after decades, and maybe losing a few toes, did they earn the terrifying title of master and the math skills to match? No calculators or geometry textbooks here. These builders figured out how to transfer weight from towering wooden roofs through arches, down columns, and out through flying buttresses. Mess up, and whole sections could collapse, which happened a lot. Collapses at Beauvais, Lincoln, even in Cologne. Every disaster became a lesson for the next project. But after every failure came a miracle. The precision at places like Reims or Amiens Cathedral would make modern engineers sweat. These men eyeballed angles with string and chalk, crafting structural marvels that have lasted centuries. They worked with stonecutters, carpenters, glaziers, and laborers on what was basically the most chaotic group project of the century. They didn't just draw plans. They ran the whole construction ecosystem. And sometimes they died before finishing their vision, leaving successors to guess what they meant by those weird triple vaults over the nave. Gothic cathedrals weren't just big. They were alive with stories, symbols, saints, monsters, and moral lessons carved into every surface. Can't read Latin? No worries. The stone will preach to you. Let's start with the portals. These aren't doors. They're divine gatekeepers. Imagine walking into a church under a crowd of saints, apostles, and the Last Judgment Day, all staring down at you, carved into every arch. Jesus in the center, calm but judging. Sinners dragged to hell by demons, right next to merchants and bakers. Subtle message. Pay your tithes, or else. And no, those gargoyles aren't just medieval waterspouts. They're theological bodyguards, designed to ward off evil spirits and probably a few misbehaving churchgoers. Grotesques growl from the rooftops, showing their stone faces in eternal agony or laughter. Some are demons, some hybrids, dog-faced men, winged bishops. Every cathedral has its own bestiary carved in stone. Inside, the columns aren't simple cylinders. They're symbolic forests. Capitals at the top have tiny carvings. Cain killing Abel, Noah drunk and teasing his sons, or monks fighting snails don't ask. Choir stalls get even bolder. Hidden in the wood are carvings of bloated peasants, lustful monks, and animals doing very naughty things. But not all of it is jokes and curses. This stone masterpiece is basically a 3D Bible. From creation to Christ's suffering, from Old Testament kings to little-known local saints, every little detail teaches a lesson. These churches are theology textbooks for the illiterate, grand sermons carved in limestone. Meanwhile, the craftsmen worked in secrecy. Most didn't sign their work. Their reward wasn't fame. It was faith. Though sometimes, a sneaky signature would slip in. Maybe a tiny self-portrait or a carved insult aimed at a rival mason 2 floors down. The stone told stories and doubled as propaganda. Kings, bishops, and local patrons often demanded their faces appear next to saints. Political rivals, demonized. The church's enemies, boiling forever in earthly hell. Walk into a Gothic church, and after your neck starts screaming from looking up, the first thing you notice is the light. Not just sunlight, but colored light. Sacred light. Light that tells stories and makes you feel like you've stepped into a whole other world. Welcome to the age of stained glass. For the Goths, light wasn't just illumination. It was theology. God was light. And the church was supposed to give you a taste of heaven on earth. So naturally, it needed blazing windows full of heavenly fire. These windows were huge, especially compared to their Roman predecessors. And they weren't just for show. They were grand, stained glass comic books. The rose windows of Chartres and Notre Dame were basically giant, colorful graphic novels. You'd see the world's creation in one panel, Noah's Ark in another, and Christ's entire family tree woven into a red and blue kaleidoscope. Every pane had a purpose. Red meant blood and martyrdom. Blue stood for the Virgin Mary. Yellow for divine light. Green for rebirth. Each piece was hand-cut, painted with fine iron oxide lines, then fired in a kiln. The result, glass that outlasted kingdoms. This wasn't a one-man show. Stained glass artists worked in teams. Designers, painters, glass cutters, all like a medieval movie studio, usually funded by the community. Local guilds sponsored entire windows, sometimes sneakily slipping in a personal plaque at the bottom. This window was gifted by the fishmongers. May their herring always be fresh. The impact on worshippers, pure awe. Imagine you're a peasant whose biggest thrill is the annual pig slaughter. Then you walk into a wall of light saints glowing in ruby and sapphire. Halos brighter than the sun. Feels like stepping into the New Jerusalem. But it's not just about beauty. These windows preached. You'd learn Christ's life in pictures. Watch virtue battle vice. Uncover metaphors of sin and redemption, all without reading a single word. And as the sun moved, the mood shifted, and morning brought warm golden hues. At noon, the nave blazed with holy fire. At dusk, the windows flickered like dying embers, reminding everyone that light, like life, is fleeting. To medieval villagers, flying buttresses probably looked like magical architecture. Huge stone arms jutting out from church walls, connecting to other arms that didn't even touch the building. Madness. But to master builders, these weird appendages were the secret weapons of the Gothic Revolution. This was their problem to solve. Gothic churches were tall, scary tall. Ceilings soared 100 feet or more. And those towering vaults pushed tons of weight outward, not just down, Without support for that sideways shove, your fancy church would collapse into a very expensive pile of rubble. Enter flying buttresses, the structural cheat code, instead of thick, heavy walls like Romanesque churches, churches filled with sacred fire. At twilight, the windows flickered like dying embers, reminding everyone that light, like life, is fleeting. To medieval villagers, flying buttresses probably looked like some kind of magical architecture. Huge stone arms jutting out from the church walls, connecting to other arms that didn't even touch the building. Madness. But to master builders, these weird limbs were the secret weapon of the Gothic Revolution. Here's the problem. They had to solve. Gothic churches were tall, terrifyingly tall, ceilings soaring 100 feet or more, and those towering vaults pushed tons of weight outward, not just down. Without support for those sideways forces, your fancy church would collapse into an expensive pile of rubble. Enter the flying buttress, a structural cheat code. Instead of building thick, heavy walls like Romanesque churches, Gothic architects wanted walls with loads of windows. And since windows are basically architectural holes, something had to keep the building standing. That something was the flying buttress, an external arch that took the vault's force and safely funneled it to a distant pier. The result, interior walls could be thin, open, and covered in stunning stained glass. But these weren't just functional bones. They became part of the church's look. Builders carved them, decorated them with spikes and hooks, even turned them into tiny stone forests. Look at Notre Dame in Paris or Amiens Cathedral, and you'll see these supports parading around like Gothic soldiers guarding the entrances. Each one a math victory. They had to be placed exactly right, at the right angle, balanced with just the right thrust. Too weak, they'd snap under pressure. Too strong, they'd crush the nave in the middle. It's like a medieval Goldilocks problem, except the porridge is made of granite, and failure meant disaster. Of course, not every experiment went smoothly. Beauvais Cathedral was famously over the top. This project was supposed to be the tallest building, but despite reinforcements and supports, parts kept collapsing multiple times. To this day, it's still unfinished, proof that even the best builders hit their architectural limits. But when they got it right, the effect was like defying gravity. You'd step into a space that feels like you're floating. Walls vanish. The ceiling hangs like a cloud, and you have to ask yourself, how the heck is this still standing? At some point, Gothic builders looked at their already impressive cathedrals and thought, what if it were taller? And thus began one of the weirdest arms races in medieval Europe. The vertical competition to see who could poke God in the eye first. Towers weren't just for bells or a nice town square view. They were statements of wealth, faith, and the raw ego of the citizens. Cities weren't satisfied with modest bell towers. They wanted the tallest, flashiest statue that pilgrims would talk about long after their feet stopped bleeding. Each cathedral had its own approach. Notre Dame in Paris built two massive twin towers, standing like stone guardians on the Seine. Chartres staggered their towers unevenly, one Romanesque style, one later Gothic, because symmetry is for the faint-hearted. And Cologne Cathedral, set to become the tallest building in the world. Construction started in the 1200s. They didn't finish until the 1880s. Now, that's commitment, Next up, the spire, the Gothic world's pointy hats. Not just towers, but long spears stabbing the sky, defying logic and gravity just to prove a point. Take Salisbury Cathedral's spire, over 400 feet tall, built without steel or modern cranes, just ropes, muscle, and a dash of medieval crazy. But going higher also meant more danger. Every inch up adds load, sway, and risk. Strong winds could snap unsupported spires. Lightning strikes were constant. Some towns even hired spy watchers, people who just stared at the building to see if it was about to collapse. Yet, they kept building, partly for theology. The higher the structure, the closer to God. But partly for psychology. This was a skyline war. If your neighbor's tower was taller, you basically admitted their faith and wallet were bigger. Unacceptable. The result: a jagged forest of stone erupting all over Europe. These towers weren't just for looks. They held bells the size of wagons, clockworks, even relics. Some doubled as watchtowers or defensive bastions. Others existed just to impress, intimidate, or sometimes terrify. Gothic towers don't whisper heaven. They scream it. But alongside the power and ambition of stone, the real heartbeat of a cathedral lies elsewhere. In the human drama of those who built, worshipped, and sometimes died. Beneath every towering cathedral is a foundation of bones, literally and figuratively. These monuments of faith weren't built by angels or saints. They were built by muddy-booted humans, scarred hands, stonemasons, carpenters, glaziers, blacksmiths, and an army of nameless laborers who got no glory, only back pain. Let's start with the builders. They weren't just stone stackers. They were the craftsmen turned quarried stone into heavyweight poems. A master mason could design the church. But the real magic was done by the skilled workers and apprentices. They were the ones carving, chiseling, and dragging the stone around. Every block had to fit perfectly. No room for screw-ups. One mistake, and the whole thing could collapse. Then came the carpenters. They didn't just build scaffolding. Nope. They crafted machines too. Giant wheeled cranes powered by guys walking like hamsters on a wheel. Mobile platforms. Precision wooden molds for pouring mortar. The wooden frames inside the vaults or arches had to be spot on. Or the whole thing would fall the second they took them down. No pressure there. And let's not forget the mortar mixers, rope makers, water carriers, and the poor souls who had to climb to the tower tops to place the last stone, all for a few coins a week and the privilege of not dying on the job. Many workers lived on site in makeshift villages sprouting around the cathedral grounds. These camps had their own rules, food stalls, and probably too many pubs. Accidents happened all the time. Tools slipped, stones shattered. Sometimes entire scaffolds collapsed. Injuries were often fatal, and workers were just considered replaceable. But why did they do it for some? It was steady work in a world that didn't offer much else. For others, it was a way to serve God, to be part of something eternal. And for a few literate or ambitious folks, it was a path into guild membership, maybe even social climbing. Most never saw their work finished. Building a cathedral could take 100 years or more. One mason might carve a corner of a window frame, knowing his grandson would finish the opposite side. That's the cathedral building rhythm. Long, grueling, spanning generations. You weren't building for yourself. You were building for eternity. And even though we don't know their names, their fingerprints remain on the stones, on the glass, on those weightless vaults that somehow still stand. You've seen the outside. You've gawked at the towering spires and light-filled windows. But what's it all for? Step inside a Gothic cathedral at its peak. And it's not just a building. It's a cosmic stage. With the Mass as the main act, the day kicks off at dawn, when monks or priests chant the first of 7 daily prayers. If you're just a farmer, you probably don't show up for that. You come on Sundays, holidays, or when the bells ring loud enough to remind you salvation might be on the line. Mass isn't a quiet event. It's a sensory overload. Incense drifts in the air. Bells ring at key moments. Latin hymns echo off stone, bouncing around the vaulted ceilings. You might not catch a word. But who cares? You're witnessing something sacred, not sitting through a lecture. Then there are relics. Almost every church has one. A saint's finger, a shard of the true cross, a vial of holy tears, some genuinely creative stuff. These aren't just curiosities. They hold spiritual power. Pilgrims traveled hundreds of miles just to see, touch, or be near them. And where pilgrims go, money follows. Relics bring prestige, donations, and a booming souvenir market. Special events turned cathedrals into full-on theaters. Think coronations, royal weddings, funerals, or Easter Mass with choirs lined up on balconies, organs blasting, and bishops in gold robes parading down the nave. It's sacred spectacle designed to dazzle and overwhelm. But not every day was a big event. Cathedrals were also everyday hangouts. They doubled as meeting halls, schools, courts, and even storm shelters. Merchants sometimes set up stalls outside. Townsfolk gathered on the steps. Kids played tag inside when no one was watching. Of course, tensions existed. Not everyone was equally welcome. Women often got pushed to the back. The poor might get free bread, but rarely a voice. Relics that brought prestige, donations, and a booming souvenir market. Special events turned churches into full-on theaters. Think coronations, royal weddings, funerals, or Easter services with choirs lined up on balconies, organs booming, and bishops in gold-trimmed robes parading down the nave. Sacred ceremonies designed to wow and overwhelm. But it wasn't all grand occasions. Churches were daily hangouts too. They served as meeting halls, schools, courts, even storm shelters. Merchants sometimes set up stalls outside. Townsfolk gathered on the steps. Kids played tag indoors when no one was looking. Of course, tensions existed. Not everyone got equal welcome. Women were often pushed to the back. The poor might get free bread, but rarely a voice. And the clergy, they lived in their own world's strict hierarchy, well-fed, and sometimes more corrupt than holy. Still, the church remained the city's heart, where heaven met earth. Time moved differently, and stone and ritual blended to remind everyone of their place in the grand sacred order. By the late 1500s, the Gothic Church, once the crown jewel of Christianity, had become a relic itself. The world was changing, and those majestic towers and stained glass sermons suddenly felt outdated. The Renaissance was here, bringing a new obsession classicism. Architects and patrons now looked to ancient Rome for inspiration. They wanted symmetry, domes, and clean lines, not flying buttresses and a forest of pointed arches. For the Renaissance, ancient Rome was the muse. They craved symmetry, domes, and clean lines, not flying buttresses and a forest of pointy arches. For the Renaissance crowd, Gothic architecture was anything but divine. It was downright barbaric. They even called it Gothic as an insult, because the Goths had sacked Rome centuries earlier. But it wasn't just about looks. The Protestant Reformation shook the very foundations the church was building on. Reformers like Martin Luther slammed the church's extravagance and obsession with relics, rituals, and indulgences, all the things grand cathedrals screamed at you. In many Protestant areas, big churches got stripped of their treasures. Stained glass shattered. Statues got beheaded. Altars whitewashed. The light that used to dance through sacred scenes now just hits bare, empty walls. Meanwhile, Catholic areas doubled down on the bling. The Counter-Reformation led to the Baroque overhaul. Gold, marble, and theatrical flair replaced the subtle mystique of Gothic. The once gloomy nave turned into a stage for a sparkling show. Some churches got so drastically revamped that their Gothic architecture vanished under layers of plaster and angel statues. And let's not forget the financial crash. War, plague, and trade route shifts basically meant big projects got no cash. Many churches were left half-finished. Towers stopped mid-build. Spires turned into tree stumps. Guilds of skilled craftsmen dissolved. The age of master builders faded like smoke through a broken rose window. But Gothic's death wasn't the end of the story. In the 19th century, the Gothic revival swept across Europe. Romanticism rekindled a love for the Middle Ages. Writers like Victor Hugo made ruined cathedrals literary superstars. Restoration campaigns, some cautious, some disastrous, tried to bring back their former glory. Think Notre Dame before the fire. Think Cologne Cathedral, finally finished after centuries. Today, Gothic churches still stand, some pristine, some battle-scarred. They're not just monuments to faith, but to ambition, imagination, and the human urge to touch the sky with stone. The Gothic boom might be over, but its echoes still ring through every arch, every shadow, every splash of colored light. The Gothic explosion may have ended, but its echoes still ripple through every arch, every shadow, every shard of stained glass. By the late 13th century, the era of Crusader kingdoms in the Holy Land had collapsed. The grand Christian conquests of Jerusalem, Antioch, Edessa, all fell one by one. After nearly 200 years of European crusading, the only thing left was the port city of Acre, a last outpost on the Mediterranean coast, a symbol of glory turned fortress of despair. Acre wasn't just any city. It was the Crusader capital, the heart of what remained of the kingdom of Jerusalem. Stone walls, Gothic churches, and a cultural melting pot. Merchants from Genoa and Venice, warrior monks from the Knights Templar, and hospitallers, plus nobles clinging to titles that had lost real power long ago. But beneath the wealth and towering walls, Acre was a powder keg. European factions in the city spent more time fighting each other than preparing for the inevitable siege. The writing had been on the wall for years. The Mamluks, an elite military force from Egypt, were wiping out every Crusader stronghold in their path, under Sultan Qalawun and later his son Al-Ashraf Khalil. The Mamluks devastated city after city, and they weren't negotiating, they were erasing. In 1290, a dumb spark lit the fuse. Newly arrived Crusaders, hot-headed and clueless, massacred Muslim merchants in Acre during a drunken brawl. Exactly the excuse the Mamluks needed. Khalil declared war. By April 1291, his mighty army, maybe over 100,000 strong, laid siege to the city. Siege towers pushed forward, tunnels dug beneath walls, catapults and fire rained down nonstop, day and night. Inside the city, panic soared. The defenders, brave but outnumbered, called for reinforcements. Back in Europe, no dice. Acre was isolated, cut off by land and then the sea. Still, the defenders clung to hope. Acre's double walls had held off sieges before. The Templars and Hospitallers braced for the worst. Noble families packed their treasures. Priests prayed. Soldiers sharpened blades that might never leave their sheaths. Because this wasn't a siege for ransom or territory. This would be the end of Crusader presence in the Holy Land. Why? April 5, 1291. The Siege of Acre officially began. The Mamluk army, led by Sultan al-Ashraf Khalil, arrived in full force. Engineers, archers, elite cavalry, and a full siege kit ready to flatten a city twice its size. They surrounded Acre from every angle, building giant wooden siege towers and digging trenches, while war drums echoed across the plains outside the city's massive walls. This noise wasn't just for show. It was a promise, no mercy coming your way. Inside Acre, the defenders stared out at a sea of tents and banners. The Mamluks were seasoned pros, disciplined as hell. This was no ragtag gang. These were the same warriors who crushed the Mongols at Analut, smashed Antioch, and took Tripoli. Their track record screamed, "Don't mess with us." When they showed up, cities burned. The Crusader soldiers responded with everything they had. Knights Templar, Hospitallers, and Teutonic Knights took their spots on the walls. Civilians fetched water, patched damage, and threw up makeshift barricades. Priests walked the ramparts, giving last rites to men who hadn't even drawn their swords yet. But the unity inside the city was a fragile illusion. The Italians, Venetians, Genoese, and Pisans fought over ships and port control. The French and English factions didn't trust each other one bit. The King of Jerusalem, Henry II of Cyprus, was technically in charge, but mostly just a figurehead. No single strategy could unite them. Meanwhile, the Mamluks wasted no time. Their engineers started tunneling under Acre's outer walls, setting wooden supports and filling the tunnels with flammable stuff. Light those babies up, and the walls would collapse from beneath. Siege engines hurled huge stones day and night, smashing towers, tearing roofs off, and showering debris over houses, churches, and courtyards every day. Parts of the city crumbled a bit more. Every night, the defenders rebuilt, exhausted and overwhelmed. Khalil kept a calm, methodical attitude. He knew Acre's walls were strong, but not unbreakable. He just needed time. The defenders, utterly drained, were stuck in a vicious cycle of panic and false hope. And the psychological warfare was just as brutal. Muslim messengers shouted threats of death if the city didn't surrender. Survivors of previous Mamluk conquests knew these weren't empty words. Acre was isolated, besieged, and running out of time. As April turned into May, Acre's walls still stood but barely. The constant pounding from Mamluk siege engines reduced towers to rubble, shattered outer defenses, and littered the streets with debris. The city's defenders clung to whatever strong points remained, exhausted and outnumbered, but still unbroken. The Knights Templar and Hospitallers led the charge literally and figuratively. These weren't rookies. They were battle-hardened veterans trained for moments like this, clad in iron armor, black shields, and blood-stained cloaks. They counterattacked from walls and inner towers, hoping to stop the Mamluk advance. Every sortie was a gamble. Sometimes they came back with their heads. Other times, not so lucky. Inside the city, panic spread fast. Civilians, women, kids, merchants, priests crowded the docks, praying for ships that never showed. Some tried bribing sailors for spots on merchant vessels. Others clung to churches, relics, saints, hoping for divine intervention. King Henry II of Cyprus had already fled, leaving a crumbling command behind. Coordination among defenders broke down. Genoese blamed Pisans. Pisans blamed the Templars, and the Templars blamed everyone else. The city was besieged not just by Mamluks, but by its own helplessness. Still, there were moments of desperate heroism. One night, the Mamluks broke through a small section near the tower. Expecting a quick massacre, they charged in, only to be caught off guard by a Hospitaller counterattack. Attacks, literally and figuratively. These guys weren't rookies. They were battle-hardened veterans trained for moments just like this, decked out in iron armor, wielding black shields and blood-splattered cloaks. They launched counterattacks from walls and towers inside, hoping to halt the Mamluk advance. Every sortie out the gate was a gamble. Sometimes they came back with their heads, sometimes not. Inside the city, panic was spreading. Civilians, women, kids, merchants, priests crowded the docks, praying for ships that never showed up. Some tried bribing sailors for a spot on merchant ships. Others clung to churches, relics, and saints, begging for divine intervention. King Henry II of Cyprus had fled earlier, leaving a broken command structure behind. Coordination among defenders fell apart. The Genoese blamed the Pisans blamed the Templars, and the Templars blamed everyone else. This city wasn't just besieged by the Mamluks, it was trapped by its own helplessness. Still, there were desperate moments of heroism. One night, the Mamluks broke through a small section near the tower. Expecting a quick massacre, they stormed in, only to be surprised by a counterattack from the Hospital Knights. In the chaos, swords clashed under torchlight, bodies hit the waves, and for a brief moment, the Crusaders pushed them back. The breach was temporarily sealed, but these wins were fleeting. Food supplies started running out. Wells got poisoned or destroyed by falling debris. Disease spread through refugee shelters. Rats feasted on corpses in the streets, and morale plummeted. Defenders were running out of everything: people, weapons, time. Meanwhile, Sultan Khalil stayed calm. His engineers dug deeper, his catapults shot higher, and his archers fired. No rush for him. He knew Acre's clock was ticking by days, not weeks. The final blow was almost ready. Meanwhile, Acre's defenders kept praying for a miracle. May 18, 1291. The waiting was over. At dawn, the Mamluks launched their last assault. Siege towers pushed forward. Ladders were raised. Tunnels dug beneath Acre's eastern wall were packed with wood and set ablaze. The ground shook as fire devoured the support beams. Then, with a thunderous crack, a huge chunk of wall collapsed. Stones, dust, and defenders tumbled into the moat below. The battle horn blared, and the Mamluks stormed the breach. Thousands surged in. Mamluk, heavy infantry, Sudanese archers, cavalry leading the charge. They pushed through even the city's ruined streets. The Crusader soldiers fought back with everything they had. The Knights Templar formed a shield wall, falcons ready to strike. Medics gathered terrified civilians, dragging them toward the docks. Priests shouted prayers over clashing steel, but it wasn't enough. The defense was too small, too tired, and too chaotic. The city that once withstood wave after wave was now cracking like old armor. Buildings burned, houses collapsed. The fight spilled from street to street, house to house, tower to tower. Every nook became a battlefield. The Genoese quarter fell first, taken in just hours. The Venetian complex held out longer, like a tiny fortress, but it was eventually burned to the ground. Screams echoed from the alleys as Mamluk troops advanced with ruthless precision. Resistors were slaughtered, fleeing civilians hunted down. One of the last strongholds was the Templar fortress near the harbor. Thick walls, reinforced towers. This was the final fallback if everything went south. Now, it was the last place left standing. Inside, women and children huddled in the cellars while knights fought the final battle on the walls. From the rooftops, they watched the city die. Acre, once the Crusader kingdom's pride, now a furnace of smoke and blood. As night fell, the Crusader resistance crumbled. Most surviving knights retreated to the docks, hoping to escape by sea. The harbor became a massive choke point. Families crammed onto overcrowded ships, screaming, crying, some even jumping into the water in panic. Only a handful of vessels managed to sail before the Mamluks took control of the port. By day's end, Acre was no longer a city. It was a graveyard. While the rest of Acre burned and bled out, one stubborn fortress still stood, the Templar Fortress, a massive stone complex near the sea. These walls had held off Mamluk sieges before. Now, it was the last refuge for hundreds of survivors, knights, women, children, and priests all squeezed into the great halls, praying the walls would hold for just one more day. The fortress was commanded by Peter d'Ivray, the Templar Marshal of Acre. He knew what was coming. He ordered the gates shut tight, guards posted along the walls, and all secret passages sealed. The knights stood shoulder to shoulder, some wounded, others barely able to lift their swords. They weren't fighting to win. They were fighting to die with purpose. Outside, the Mamluks besieged the fortress. Sultan Khalil sent envoys to negotiate surrender. The terms brutal. Prison for the knights. Slavery for the civilians. The Templars refused. They weren't under any illusions about mercy. The Mamluks brought siege engines and launched the final assault. Day after day, they battered the walls. But the fortress was built to withstand worse. For over a week, the Templars fought back by firing from towers, hurling stones, and pouring boiling oil on any attacker brave enough to climb the ladders. Inside, conditions were dire. Food was almost gone. The wounded moaned in the dark. Kids cried, but kept fighting. There's even a story of one night when a man pulled, "I stormed the wall with a broken leg just to throw a rock before collapsing." Then, on May 28th, disaster struck. The Mamluk army smashed through the outer wall of the fortress. The battle inside the courtyard was brutal. Templar knights, civilians, Anyone who could hold a weapon grabbed one. It was a savage, no-holds-barred brawl. The defenders got pushed back into the fortress's inner rooms, step by bloody step. Realizing the end was near, the Templars made a desperate call. They deliberately blew up part of the fortress. In one last defiant act, they lured the Mamluks into the lower chambers and detonated the underground armory. The blast tore through walls, killing attackers and defenders alike in a storm of fire and flying rubble. The fortress collapsed, but it didn't surrender. The last stronghold of the Crusaders in the Holy Land fell not from defeat, but from fury. Acre was lost. The dream of a Christian church in the East shattered. When the smoke cleared, Acre was no longer a city. Once a bustling Crusader capital with markets, churches, and foreign embassies, it was now just ashes and corpses. The Mamluks took every street, every wall, leaving behind only ruins. Sultan al-Ashraf Khalil didn't just want victory, he wanted erasure. He ordered the complete destruction, the city's fortifications, every tower, every wall, every stone that once protected the Crusaders was torn down or smashed to bits. The harbor was littered with rubble. Some centuries-old churches were demolished, burned, or converted into mosques. Whatever couldn't be reused was destroyed. This destruction was systematic, not revenge, strategy. Khalil wanted to make sure Acre would never again be a foothold for Europe, never a landing spot for Crusader armies, never a symbol of Christian presence in the East again. The few survivors, mostly non-combatants, were enslaved or executed. Some noblewomen were locked up in Mamluk elite prisons. Some children were sold in markets from Cairo to Damascus. Their names vanished. Their stories ended in silence. The sea was littered with shipwrecked debris and bloated corpses. The stench lingered for weeks, even months. News of the collapse hit Europe like a slap. Panic spread through the courts of France and England. Popes wept. Missionaries called for another crusade. But the will was gone. The last flicker of fighting passion died out with the walls of Acre. European kings had their own wars and dynasties to worry about. The Holy Land was lost, and they knew it. The Templar Knights, once the elite warriors of Christendom, shattered by this loss, returned to Europe battered and purposeless. Their power would never recover. In less than 2 decades, they were completely disbanded, accused of heresy, tortured, and executed. The fall of Acre marked the beginning of their end. And for the Mamluks, conquering Acre was the jewel in their crown. The dream of a Crusader kingdom in the Levant was crushed under their feet. But the deeper legacy of the siege was just beginning, because while the city was dying, the legend of Acre, of Crusader glory and tragic downfall, was only just born. The fall of Acre in 1291 wasn't just a military defeat. It was a historic exclamation point. For nearly 2 centuries, European powers spilled blood, treasure, and faith into the Holy Land. As its territory collapsed, the entire Crusader experiment crumbled like its shattered walls. No city left to retreat to. Tyre, Sidon, Beirut, former strongholds, quickly fell. What remained were faint memories, scattered relics, and a handful of survivors who escaped by sea. Watching smoke rise on the horizon for Christendom, this was a gut-wrenching loss. The fall of Jerusalem in 1187 was a disaster. But Acre, that was the last domino. It wasn't just a military defeat. It was a total spiritual meltdown. The popes cried out desperately to restart the Crusades, but failed miserably. Europe was drained. Civil wars, plagues, and economic shifts pulled attention away from the East. The era of kings wielding crosses and marching armies into deserts was over. Meanwhile, the Islamic world was throwing a party. The Mamluks under Khalil did what many Muslim leaders dreamed of for generations. They wiped out the Latin presence here. Cities were reclaimed, mosques rebuilt, and trade routes reopened. Islam regained control over the heartland of the Levant, from Cairo to Damascus. But not everything was so black and white. The Crusades left deep scars. Cultural exchanges, good and bad, changed both East and West. Arabic texts flooded into Europe. Architecture, medicine, even food were transformed. But war also left behind a legacy of suspicion, violence, and religious division that lasted centuries. The fall of Acre didn't just close a chapter, it ended a worldview. The idea that Europe could set up shop in the Middle East, enforce its will under divine mission, and hold territory for the faith was dead. Instead, the Crusades became romanticized, dramatized, and weaponized for generations. Shining knights, noble quests, glorious failures. The reality way messier, bloodier, chaotic, and ultimately tragic. The fall of Acre sent shockwaves across Europe, not just diplomatically or religiously, but psychologically. For generations, Christendom believed it was destined to control the Holy Land, that God was on their side, that Jerusalem, Bethlehem, and Acre belonged to the faithful. Now, with the last Crusader stronghold gone, that fantasy shattered. The first reaction, skepticism. Chroniclers wrote with anger and grief. Clergy blamed sin and corruption. Kings pointed fingers at each other. How could this happen? How could a holy warrior army lose to a king from Cairo? But beneath the surface, a quiet acceptance grew. There would be no grand crusades to reclaim Acre, no 5th, 6th, or 7th European armies marching east. Instead, Europe turned inward. The Pope shifted focus to rooting out heresy at home. The Inquisition grew stronger. Kings redirected their ambitions to civil wars and dynastic struggles. The fighting spirit became more rhetoric than reality. Over time, Acre became something else in European imagination. No longer just a city, it turned into a symbol of lost glory, tragic courage, and divine punishment. Songs and poems about noble knights fighting to the death appeared. Artists and playwrights turned the fall into legend, but survivors knew the truth. Refugees fleeing Acre nobles, monks, merchants, kids returned to Europe broken. Many had no home to go back to. Some were taken in by monasteries. Others wandered, telling tales of fire and blood. Eventually, the Teutonic Knights shifted their focus to Eastern Europe. The Knights Templar returned to France, where the shadow of Acre would haunt them for years. Decline, but Acre just wouldn't quit. It stuck around in memories, in propaganda, in the way Europeans talked about the East, a place both dangerous and mysterious. But hey, full of opportunity too, a lost land. Maybe one day to be restored to its old glory. The city itself vanished. But the legend of Acre O, that just started spreading way beyond its dark, crumbling walls. Centuries after it was destroyed, Acre still haunts imaginations. Stones crushed to dust, churches built, walls dragged down to the sea. But in the minds of European chroniclers and later historians, Acre was more than a city. It became a symbol of the tragic fall of the Crusades, the place where knightly spirit died, where faith collided with vanity, and where the dream of a Christian East got buried under those Mamluk boots. But what's left behind isn't the truth about Acre. It's the legend, romanticized in ballads and epics. Acre's defenders aren't remembered as stubborn lords and disillusioned mercenaries, but as noble knights fighting bravely to the bitter end. Political chaos, greed, internal betrayal, all smoothed over to make a more palatable story. Martyrdom, heroism, doomed fate. Ironically, the people who actually lived in Acre probably didn't see themselves as part of this grand epic. They were merchants, sailors, cooks, scribes, prostitutes, pilgrims, folks living in a complex, multicultural city where Arabs, French, Italians, Greeks, and Latins blended on the streets. A city full of contradictions, monasteries next to brothels, holy warriors alongside Venetian bankers. Things were never simple, but history rarely is in the Islamic world. Acre's fall is remembered as a great victory, proof of Allah's justice, a triumph over foreign invaders. But even that story often gets overshadowed by the bigger legacy of other Islamic conquests. For the Mamluks, Acre was just one gem among many. Important, sure, but not the whole crown. Today, modern Akko is a livable city. Once again, it's a UNESCO World Heritage Site with layers of Crusader architecture buried beneath. Ottoman streets. Tourists stroll through ancient tunnels where knights once spilled blood. Minarets stand beside Gothic arches. Fishermen cast nets from the very docks where refugees once leapt into the sea, begging for their lives. The past hasn't disappeared. It's just buried under stone, under legend, under time. And that, my friend, is Acre's real legacy. Not just a city or a battle, it's a crossroads, a melting pot of cultures, empires, and ideals, where faith, ambition, and fear tangled up in a blazing final moment. The siege of Acre ended an era, but it also made sure neither the Crusades nor their ghosts would ever really be forgotten. Olivia Drusilla was born in 58 BC, at a time when the Roman Republic was in chaos, daughter of Marcus Livius Drusus Claudianus. She came from an ancient noble line with a taste for power and a knack for surviving Rome's endless bloody political battles. Her inheritance was privilege, but her world was chaos. Late Republican Rome wasn't just politically unstable. It was a festering wound. Civil war erupted between power-hungry generals. Alliances shattered like pottery, and assassination was basically a career move for a girl like Livia. Growing up in this mess, the lesson was clear. Beauty might grab attention, but intelligence, loyalty, and cold calculation, that's what kept you alive. At just 15, Livia married her cousin, Tiberius Claudius Nero, a loyal Republic supporter and enemy of Julius Caesar. It wasn't a love match. It was politics, like most Roman marriages. But young Livia quickly adapted to her role as a Roman manager, the faithful wife, future mother, and quiet observer of the chaos swirling around her. When Caesar was assassinated in 44 BC, the real shockwaves began. The Roman steward, the loyal wife, the mother-to-be, and the silent observer of the chaos around her. When Caesar was assassinated in 44 BC, The real shockwave began. Civil war flared up fiercely again. Mark Antony and Octavian, Caesar's heirs, fought to fill the power vacuum. And Livia, she and her husband, lost. Pregnant with her second child, she was forced to flee Rome, moving from one temporary hideout to another. While her husband dodged Octavian's wrath, this harsh, uncertain exile forged her, and when she finally returned to Rome, a fragile pardon, she didn't just come back as a survivor. She came back as someone worth watching. That's when she met Octavian. He was 24. She was 19. Both of them. But when Octavian saw Livia, he saw more than just a pretty face. He saw an equal. Within months, they both dumped their spouses, and in one of Rome's most scandalous political marriages, Octavian married Livia while she was still pregnant with her ex-husband's kid. For the rest of her life, she stuck by Octavian when he became Augustus, Rome's first emperor. Livia was more than just his wife. She was his advisor, his partner in crime. And some even whispered she was the one really pulling the strings. When Livia married Octavian in 38 BC, the Roman elite were drunk on gossip. He was a rising political star, soon to be Augustus, Rome's first emperor. And she was a pregnant divorcee. Scandalous doesn't even begin to cover it. But Augustus didn't care. And Livia, she knew exactly what she was doing. Unlike his first wife, Scribonia, whom Augustus ditched the day their daughter was born, Livia wasn't some emotional distraction. She was quiet, calculating, and politically savvy. Augustus didn't just marry a woman, he got a strategist from day one. Livia made it clear she wasn't some decorative plus one. She was co-ruler in all but name. She threw parties, schmoozed senators, advised her husband on political rivals, and carefully crafted her image as the ideal Roman woman, modest, obedient, loyal. But behind that humble, fake, face-covered act was a brain sharper than half the Senate combined, though she never got the official title of empress while alive because Rome she wielded influence like a shadow queen. She had her own household, her own finances, even her own bodyguards. Never before had a Roman woman been given that kind of power. But Augustus trusted her completely, and Livia played the long game. She didn't crave public power. Instead, she made herself indispensable. When Augustus was away, Livia ran the show. When senators plotted, she whispered counterplots. When rivals rose, they often fell suspiciously fast. Livia's fingerprints were rarely seen, but her shadow loomed large behind the scenes, like a silent ghost. And maybe most importantly, Livia never bore Augustus a son. Their marriage was childless, but instead of fading into irrelevance, she made sure her son from her first marriage, Tiberius, stayed glued to the royal path. Livia didn't want to be queen. She wanted to build a dynasty. To outsiders, she seemed passive, graceful, and pious. She showed up to religious ceremonies, praised Augustus publicly, and lived modestly in a city obsessed with luxury. But anyone who underestimated her paid dearly, because while Augustus united the Roman world with legions and edicts, Livia shaped the empire in silence with whispers, favors, and quiet erasers. The question is, how far would she go to protect the dynasty she was building? Rumor has it, she didn't just stick to political advice, despite her graceful, devoted public image. The name Livia Drusilla always carried a whiff of suspicion, especially the sweet, sharp scent of poison, as Rome switched from republic to empire. Augustus's rivals toppled like dominoes, and while history doesn't record Livia's fingerprints on the poisoned cup, it certainly doesn't rule it out. The most infamous accusation that Livia systematically eliminated anyone standing between her son Tiberius and the throne. Let's count the bodies. Marcellus, Augustus's favored nephew, died at 19, supposedly from illness. Gaius and Lucius Caesar, Augustus's grandsons and adopted heirs, both died young, far from home, ruled the empire quietly with whispers, favors, and stealthy erasers. The real question, how far would she go to protect the dynasty she was building? Rumor has it, she didn't just stop at political advice. Charming and devoted in public, sure, but the name Livia Drusilla always carried a whiff of suspicion, especially that sweet, sharp scent of poison. When Rome flipped from republic to empire, Augustus's rivals toppled like dominoes. History doesn't say Livia ever touched the cup, but hey, don't rule it out. The most notorious accusation, Livia systematically removed anyone standing between her son Tiberius and the throne. Let's count the bodies. Marcellus, Augustus's favored nephew, died at 19 supposedly from illness. Gaius and Lucius Caesar, Augustus's grandsons and heirs by adoption, both died young, far from home. Agrippina the Elder, the last brutal nephew, was stripped of inheritance and mysteriously murdered after Augustus died. Everything inconvenient got tossed out, and Livia was always close by. To her defenders, these deaths were just bad luck. Rome was full of disease and brutal power games. But to her critics, Livia was Rome's Lady Macbeth, quietly taking out pawns and rearranging the board so only her son stood tall. Ancient gossip, especially from Tacitus and Cassius Dio, feeds this story. They paint Livia as cold, cunning, and as ruthlessly maternal as they come. They claim she was the real mastermind behind the imperial succession, not Augustus. Some versions even claim she erased Augustus's will or hid his death long enough to make sure the power switch went smoothly. But hey, let's separate smoke from fire here. There's zero solid proof Livia poisoned anyone. No confessions. No court trials. The supposed victims died far from Rome, under suspicious but vague circumstances. The Roman elite loved a good conspiracy, especially when powerful women were involved. Still, this story fits nicely. Too many rivals dead, too many inheritances rerouted, too many whispers in the shadows. Even Augustus, who loved and trusted Livia, joked she cared about the empire more than his health. Maybe just a joke, but like most Roman jokes, there's a dagger hidden under the punchline. Whether Livia slipped poison in a cup or just outmaneuvered enemies with charm and strategy, the outcome was the same, step by step. The path to power cleared, and as time passed, that became undeniable. Livia wasn't just building a dynasty. She was taking out the competition. Tiberius wasn't the golden child. He didn't have Marcellus's charm, Gaius's popularity, or Julius Caesar's legacy. He was awkward, cold, and super introverted. More the type to brood alone on a cliffside than rule the Roman Empire. But thanks to Livia, Tiberius became emperor. Elevating her son's status wasn't easy. Augustus didn't trust him. Tiberius had military skills, but little interest in politics, known for mood swings, disappearances, and publicly bowing out of Roman life in 6 BCE, basically flipping Augustus and Livia the bird. But Livia stayed determined. she arranged his comeback, slowly and methodically. She knocked out rivals and weakened Augustus's resistance. With every royal disappointment, Marcellus dying young, Lucius's sudden illness, Gas's failed eastern campaign, Tiberius looked more like the least terrible option. Finally, Augustus officially adopted him as son and heir. Not love, just resignation. And when Augustus died in 14 CE, the empire passed to Tiberius. That should have been Livia's victory moment, her son crowned, her legacy secured. But power made weird things happen to Tiberius. Once in charge, he grew colder, more paranoid, and suspicious. He left the city for long stretches, ruled by letter, and handed power to the cruel Sejanus. He raged at the Senate, the people, even his own mother. Livia tried to keep influence. She wanted to be treated like Augustus treated her as advisor, partner. She was granted the title Augusta, an unprecedented honor for a Roman woman. Coins were minted with her image, statues raised to honor her. She sat on the throne beside her son at public ceremonies, but behind closed doors. Tiberius silently resented her. He accused her of manipulating him, scripting a life he didn't want. Rumor is, he refused to consult her. And, worst of all, he didn't attend her funeral when she died in 29 CE, leaving her body unburied for days, a final public insult to the woman who gave him everything. Livia might have won the succession battle, but she lost the war for her son's affection. Livia Drusilla understood what most Roman men didn't. Real power doesn't always come from the Senate or the battlefield. It comes from perception. So while Augustus built an empire, Livia shaped herself into the ideal Roman woman. Not a queen, not a ruler, but something way more dangerous, a symbol. She dressed modestly in traditional cloaks and veils, never flashing jewels or gold. Her hair styled plainly, seriously, like the noble Roman ladies back in the day, in public. She was all business, all Roman virtue, praising simplicity, virtue, and piety. Behind the scenes, she was running the influence networks, managing estates, arranging marriages, and shaping the political future. But her biggest project was none other than herself. Livia became the poster child for Roman values. Her statues popped up all over the empire, not just in Rome, but in provinces where loyalty to the new imperial order needed a little nudge. These weren't statues of goddesses or warriors. Nope. They showed her sitting calmly, like a serene mom. The message, crystal clear. Rome's new empire was safe in the hands of a wise, moral, and traditional woman. It was a masterclass in soft power. She sponsored public works and religious rituals. She linked herself to a chain of goddesses and the cult of Vesta, a symbol of fertility and family order. While Augustus bragged about finding Rome, a city of bricks, and leaving it one of marble, Livia made sure the marble included her too. Even the coins changed. Some bore her face, a first for a Roman woman. Others shouted out her virtues: pietas, concordia, fortuna. Livia wasn't just a manager. She was an ethical compass, carved in silver, not vanity insurance. In a man's world, where women could be tossed aside any time, Livia baked herself into Rome's political DNA. She wasn't just backing power. She was the machine. And Augustus was on board too. He mentioned her in his will, left her a third of his wealth, and even reluctantly adopted her into the Julian family. giving her the name Julia Augusta, a political move, sure, but also a nod to her role in building the empire through image, patience, and ruthless charm. Livia remade herself into a new kind of woman, too powerful to ignore, too respected to oust, and too smart to underestimate. When you look at the Julio-Claudian mess of crazy emperors, monsters, and maniacs, you'd never guess it was built by a soft-spoken woman in a side booth. But Livia Drusilla was more than Rome's first lady. She was the dynasty's engineer. Her long game started with her own son, Tiberius. She cleared the board for him. But her ambitions didn't stop there. Grandkids, great-grandkids, and stepchildren were woven into a web of alliances, engagements, and strategic deals. This wasn't family planning. This was royal architecture. She arranged a marriage between her granddaughter, Livilla, and Drusus the Younger. Her grandson, another granddaughter, Julia the Younger, was linked with Lucius Aemilius Paulus, a senator. Each move was a brick in the royal foundation. But Livia wasn't just a matchmaker. She was strengthening bloodlines, loyalty, and keeping an eye on potential enemies. Even Germanicus, the beloved general and Tiberius's adopted son, bore Livia's fingerprints when he took the throne. He married Agrippina the Elder, Augustus's granddaughter. That alliance united the Julian and Claudian clans, a symbolic and strategic win. Of course, dynasties built on politics and paranoia rarely stay clean. Internal conflicts exploded. Accusations of treason, adultery, and ambition flew among the empire's heirs. And many historians believe Livia was pulling strings or manipulating the chaos. If someone had to be exiled, discredited, or quietly disappear to protect the dynasty's core, well, so be it. Well, so be it. And ironically, the Julio-Claudian line grew crazier. After Tiberius came Caligula, Germanicus's son, and one of history's most infamous tyrants. Then Claudius, her grandson, and also her grandson-in-law. Then Nero, sharing Livia's bloodline and political game plan. By the time Nero was chilling while Rome burned, Livia's family tree looked more like a bonfire. But don't get it twisted. Every branch was shaped by Livia. She didn't live to see the dynasty collapse, but she built its foundation, bloodline with Livia and her political scheming. By the time Nero was chilling while Rome burned, Livia's family tree looked like a pile of ashes. But don't get it twisted. She shaped every branch. She didn't live to see the dynasty crumble, but she laid its foundation. While Augustus ruled a marble and legion empire, Livia ruled a quieter empire, one of blood, marriages, and manipulation. Every emperor in the next 50 years traced their legitimacy back to her. In dynasty history, she wasn't just a link in the chain. She forged the chain. Livia Drusilla lived way too long. If you ask her son Tiberius, she survived Caesar's assassination, the Republic's fall, dozens of rival heirs, and the switch to empire. She outlived Augustus, crushed enemies, and turned her family into gods. But in her later years, she found herself locked in a brutal showdown with the very man she sacrificed everything to empower Tiberius. Their relationship was never cozy. But once he became emperor, Tiberius got even frostier. He hated her influence, her constant presence at court, and her endless attempts to advise, or maybe straight up control him. And Livia, who spent decades running an empire, wasn't about to quietly retire to her villa. Court drama got real. Tiberius started retreating from Rome altogether. holed up in Capri like a royal exile. He left the ruling to Sejanus, his ambitious and ruthless Praetorian prefect. Livia stayed in Rome, surrounded by statues, titles, and the eerie silence of being honored but no longer needed, when she fell ill in 29 AD. Her death didn't get the usual mourning reserved for the matriarch of the Julio-Claudian dynasty. Tiberius refused to come back to Rome. He skipped her funeral. He delayed her burial, denied her public honors, and cruelly left her body unburied for days. For a woman who built an empire, that was a chilly, calculated snub. Was it petty revenge? Guilt? Or maybe the last defiant act of a son who never wanted to be emperor? Later historians painted Tiberius as a gloomy, paranoid ruler obsessed with his mother's legacy. Livia set up his rise, paved his way, and secured his power. But in doing so, she might have crushed any warmth between them. For Tiberius, her guidance was probably more like a chain. She died at 86 after living through nearly 9 decades of Rome's wildest transformations. No Roman woman ever held such lasting sway or stayed by an emperor's side so long. But her final chapter wasn't marked by triumph. It ended in silence, betrayed not by enemies, but by the very son she raised to rule. Livia Drusilla died immortal, but Rome wasn't done with her yet. Though Tiberius refused to honor her properly in death, the empire she helped shape kept her memory alive. Her grandchildren, especially Emperor Claudius, her grandson and grandson-in-law, eventually restored her place in the imperial cult in 42 AD. More than a decade after her death, Claudius declared Livia a goddess. She became Diva Augusta, a goddess of the state, the ultimate cosmic promotion for the woman who spent her life pulling power strings from the shadows. Altars were built, priestesses appointed. Her image merged with Augustus's in temples and rituals. In death, she became a goddess no woman before her ever was, officially recognized by Rome. But sanctification didn't come with forgiveness. For centuries, Livia's name got tangled in rumors. Ancient historians, mostly men, were never quite sure about her. Tacitus called her calculating, cold, a master of sexual politics. Cassius Dio painted her as a real-life queen of chaos, cunning, scheming, maybe responsible for a few well-timed murders. Then Suetonius showed up with his mix of gossip and history. He never outright said Livia poisoned Augustus. But man, did he let that rumor fly? Yet even her critics had to admit she was brilliant. She lived modestly. She ruled quietly. She never flaunted her influence, never made public speeches, never took official political roles. Still, she shaped Rome's fate more than most toga-clad men. Modern historians try to separate fact from fiction. Was she a killer or just a savvy strategist, a faithful wife, or a political mastermind? The truth might be all of the above. But her influence is undeniable. No Livia, no Tiberius, no Tiberius, no Julio-Claudian dynasty. Her hand guided the empire's first steps. Her lineage ruled the first century, and the legend of her haunts historians 2,000 years later in a city of emperors, conquerors, and demigods. Livia did something no woman had ever done before. She ruled Rome from the shadows and ascended to the heavens, not with swords or speeches, but with sheer survival in the end. Livia Drusilla's story isn't just about palaces. poison, or statues. It's about a woman who navigated the nastiest political landscape in history without ever raising a sword or even raising her voice. Rome was a world that kicked women out of real power, but somehow, Livia rewrote the rules without ever admitting she was the author. She never spoke in the Senate, never led the army, never held an official title during her husband's reign. Yet, for 5 decades, not a single major imperial decision happened without her say-so. She made herself indispensable to Augustus not through charm or sweetness, but with loyalty, brains, and total control over her image in a culture obsessed with modesty and women. She became the living embodiment of Roman virtue. She was wife, mother, goddess, but also a chess master, a kingmaker, and some even whispered she was Rome's queen in everything but name. Her genius was subtlety, while other royal women like Messalina or Agrippina the Younger got slammed for ambition. Livia dodged blame, wrapped in virtue like armor, and by doing that, she designed the blueprint for every powerful Roman woman after her. But her legacy is complicated. The dynasty she built would crumble into madness and murder. Her descendants included emperors like Caligula and Nero, whose wild antics tarnished the very name she worked so hard to build. And her relationship with Tiberius didn't end in victory, but in silence and coldness. Power comes at a price. But despite it all, Livia endured. She remains one of the most fascinating figures in ancient history, not because she ruled Rome like a man, but because she ruled in a way no man could with patience, silence, and the terrifying intelligence of someone who knew real power isn't loud power. There's always a price to pay. Still, Livia endured. She remains one of ancient history's most fascinating figures, not because she ruled Rome like a man, but because she ruled in a way no man could with patience, silence, and the terrifying smarts of someone who knows real power isn't shouting, it whispers. Livia Drusilla didn't just witness the birth of an empire. She delivered it. She didn't just maintain a dynasty. She designed it. And she didn't need a throne or crown to make history. All she needed was time. And from the start, Livia mastered the long game.